I stared out the window into the pitch black night. There was nothing but trees for as far as the eye could see that were so thick, the highway we were supposed to be driving towards wasn't even visible. The raging snowstorm that pelted our truck with wind and ice was making our already poor visibility 10 times worse. Our truck suddenly hit a large bump in the road that made the entire vehicle bounce, giving me a mini heart attack. The bump reminded me once again that the so-called dirt road we were driving on was nothing more than an oversized bike path. We hadn't seen another vehicle since turning onto this road over half an hour ago, which meant my father was the only person either brave or crazy enough to take it. The sounds of the snow and ice pellets raining down onto the front windshield were loud enough to be heard over my music, despite me wearing noise-canceling earphones. I tried my best to ignore the noise by turning up the volume, but even with the sound turned up all the way, the howling winds and ice pellets slamming against our truck were still audible. We were driving back from Halifax, Nova Scotia, on our way home to Prince Edward Island. My father, who was currently holding the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were turning white, had decided that we should take a shortcut through this back road in the woods. Even though it was apparently making the drive shorter, it also made the driving conditions a whole lot worse. I had no idea why my father was so confident about this shortcut, considering he had only been to Nova Scotia a few times in his life. But like always, I trusted his judgment. I looked over at my father, who, despite obviously being stressed out by the driving conditions, looked back at me and smiled. He started to tell me something, forgetting that I had my earphones in and couldn't hear a word he was saying over my music. I took my earphones out, and he repeated what he had just said. "I'm real proud of you, Josh." His compliment made me glance down at the gold medal hanging around my neck, which was about as comfortable as a 50-pound weight. I should have felt proud wearing the medal, considering I had just won the Junior Atlantic Canada Boxing Provincials, yet all I felt was embarrassment. I had only won the medal because regardless of the raging snowstorm that made getting there nearly impossible, they had decided to run the event anyway, so hardly anyone showed up. Due to the lack of people, all I had to do to make it into the championship match was beat 2 guys. One of whom was close to my size, but went down after only a few punches, and the second guy had the stomach flu and forfeited before the fight even started. Then in the championship match, me and a guy nearly twice my size fought for a few rounds until I went down because he was kicking my ass. I got back up and he continued to pummel me until I went back down again. This went on for some time until he finally got tired of me getting back up. After I went down for probably the 6th time, he punched me in the back of the head and yelled at me to stay down, getting himself disqualified. So I won first place by default. I didn't really feel like talking about my meaningless victory, so I just mumbled, "Thanks," and went back to staring out the window. My dad was an all-star boxer formerly known as Nathan Knockout Davis. He was one of the best boxers Prince Edward Island had ever seen. He probably could have really made a name for himself and went professional, but he had too many injuries and had to stop when he was in his late 20s. Now he expected me to follow in his footsteps, only without getting as injured. The problem was that I was 17 and only weighed a little over 100 pounds. It seemed that nearly every kid my age or younger that I boxed against was way bigger and stronger than me. Even though I worked out just as much, if not more than they did, I couldn't put on any muscle. I also hated boxing. The sport is just 2 people putting on gloves and beating each other senseless until someone gets knocked out or the judges declare a winner. The same thing happened to me almost every day at school, except that the person fighting me didn't wear gloves and he always won. I never told my parents this because my dad would just be disappointed and my mom would make a bunch of calls and emails to the school to try and help me, but would ultimately just make things worse. So I usually lied about my cuts and bruises and said that I got them at boxing practice. Despite how much I hated boxing, I could never work up the courage to tell my father how I really felt about it because it was one of the only things he took time off work for, meaning that it was one of the few ways I could spend time with him. I was hoping that our conversation was over, but of course, since we were talking about boxing, my father kept talking. "Seriously, Josh, you did great out there. You may not have thrown as many punches as the other guy, but you kept getting up when you got knocked down." I sighed and looked back over at him. "Yeah, I guess so. I just wish that I was a bit stronger." As soon as the words came out of my mouth, I realized that I had just set my father up to say his favorite made-up quote. He smiled. "Just remember, Josh, strength is not about having power or skill or even muscle." He turned to look me right in the eye. "True strength is having the will to keep fighting even when you know you can't win." There was a long silence after he said that because I wasn't really sure how to respond. Finally, I decided to change the subject. "So, how's it going with your work?" For a temporary moment, his expression changed, as if he was remembering something unpleasant. But his smile quickly returned after he caught me glancing at him, so it must have been nothing. "It's going well," he replied. "I think we're actually about to make a huge breakthrough." After my father had quit boxing, he went back to school to get a degree in nuclear science. which landed him a job at a small company on Prince Edward Island that was developing a new isotope that could be used in nuclear medicine to better diagnose diseases. After a few years of working for the company, my father got promoted and began overseeing most of their day-to-day operations, and was also tasked with doing a monthly inspection of the company's other 17 locations across North America. Even though he had an important job, the company wasn't very profitable and his pay wasn't all that great, so our family never had much money. But if the company was about to make a huge breakthrough, all that might change. Huge breakthrough? I asked, getting excited. What do you mean? Instead of answering, he turned his attention back to the road and began to really concentrate on his driving. After a few moments of waiting for a response, I looked away as well. We were just about to cross a narrow wooden bridge that would lead us across a small, partially frozen lake. The trees seemed to be thinning out, so I knew we were nearly out of the woods. My father started picking up speed in anticipation of almost being back on the main road. That's when it happened. I heard a horrible cracking noise, like a million tree branches all being snapped at once. I looked out the windshield in horror to watch one of the biggest trees I'd ever seen break away from its stump and crash down right in front of us. My father slammed on the brakes, but I knew it was already too late. He was somehow able to turn the truck to the right so that his side took most of the impact, but that wasn't enough. Our truck crashed into the downed tree going over 60 kilometers an hour. It ended up completely flipping over the tree and rolling another 4 times. Everything happened so fast that I could hardly process what was going on, but I felt like a crash test dummy. Even though my airbag and seatbelt saved me from any serious injury, my head was slamming into everything. The door, the dashboard, even the roof. Eventually, our truck skidded to a stop right by the bank of the lake. It ended up getting flipped onto the driver's side, so my side of the truck was in the air. Now that I was no longer being violently thrown around inside the rolling truck, I managed to pull the airbag out of my face. This giant white cushion may have protected me from any major injury, but my head still felt like someone had just finished striking it with a hammer. Through my blurred vision, I looked out through the busted windshield to see that the truck was in rough shape. Both its front and rear bumpers had fallen off, and the truck had been scratched up so badly that you would think the color of the truck was white instead of black. The hood looked like it had been crushed by a boulder, and dark smoke was coming from an unknown source underneath it. There were also dozens of unidentifiable pieces of debris that littered the ground all around where the truck had come to a halt. I managed to sit up in my seat while trying to ignore the pain in my head. A sudden loud groan from my left reminded me that I was not the only person in the truck. "Dad?" I asked as I looked over at him. He looked horrible. There was a nasty gash running across his forehead and his skin looked as white as chalk. His chest and right arm were completely pinned down beneath the partially caved-in windshield, and shards of glass were sticking out of his pinned arm in multiple places. My father groaned again as he sat up and spat out a mouthful of blood. With his free arm, he held his right shoulder, which looked bent and possibly dislocated. Despite all that, he managed to choke out instructions for me. "Josh, the windshield has me pinned so I can't move. I need you to kick a hole in the windshield in front of you so you can climb out." Putting my pain aside, I followed his instructions and began kicking a hole in the part of the windshield that still remained in place. But as soon as I started kicking, I heard my dad grunt in pain as the part of the windshield that trapped him pushed against him even more with every one of my kicks. I stopped kicking to look over at him with concern, but he just looked back at me with clenched teeth and nodded for me to keep going. After a few more kicks, I eventually kicked a hole in the windshield just large enough for me to fit through. As I started to climb out, I passed through the opening in the windshield and smelled something burning. I wasn't sure what was causing the smell until I touched the hood of the truck, which was hot despite the cold winter weather. I could feel the freezing snow hit my face as soon as I crawled through the windshield. However, it seemed that the wind had died down a bit. When I passed through the hole in the windshield, I awkwardly grabbed onto the side of the hood and lowered myself to the snow-covered ground. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I took a closer look at the front of the truck and could clearly see the menacing orange flames rising from under the hood. The reality of the situation hit me. The truck was on fire. If those flames made their way to the gas tank... "Dad!" I yelled as I stumbled over to him. "I know, Josh. I can smell the smoke. I need you to go and get help. The highway isn't far from here." We both knew that if I went to get help, then I wouldn't make it back in time. I took a closer look at the flames, and my eyes widened when I saw that the fire was already making its way to the gas tank. I started pulling on the windshield that trapped my father, but it hardly budged no matter how hard I pulled. I kept yanking at it, and when my father saw the desperate look in my eyes, he began to use his one good arm to help me, despite the pain it was causing him. Seeing him struggle to get free made me work even harder by adding to my desperation. "I can do this, I can do this, I can do this!" My dad took a break from pushing the windshield and said, "Josh, you have to get out of here." As my vision began to blur with tears, I locked eyes with him and yelled, "I'm not leaving you!" He probably knew that there was no point in arguing with me, so he said, "All right, Then go into the woods and see if you can find a tree branch to pry this thing off me. I turned and started sprinting towards the woods, but I only managed to get a few steps away before the truck exploded. The force of the blast was so strong that it launched me 20 meters away from the truck and face first into a snowbank. The back of my coat and t-shirt were instantly burned away from the heat of the explosion, and my back felt like it was on fire, which it probably was. Every bone in my body screamed in pain, and my last thought before blacking out was, Dad. I woke up 2 days later in a hospital in Moncton, New Brunswick. Every inch of my body was in excruciating pain, but my back hurt the most. The first thing I saw when I woke up was my mother sitting beside my hospital bed. Her eyes were red, making it obvious that she had been crying. When she saw me open my eyes, tears of relief began falling down her face, and she smiled at me. But that smile didn't last long, because the first thing I said was, "Where's Dad?" She couldn't bring herself to say the words, but her expression told me what she could not. My father was dead. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this chapter, then please remember to leave a like on the video and subscribe to my channel. New episodes of Strength drop on Tuesdays and Fridays, but if you'd like to see the chapters early and support the channel for only $5 a month, then head on over to my Patreon page. Link is in the description, where the first 5 chapters of Strength are already posted. Also, you can purchase the full paperback novel on my website if you're in Canada, or on Amazon if you live outside of Canada. Thanks again, and I'll be back in a few days with the next episode.